Hi, David.
Hey Bob,
How you doing?
doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are David Yaden. You've got a show of your own on meaningoflife.tv, The Science of Spirituality. What
I
should we
do.
what should we call that? A semi-regular show?
Yeah, about once a month.
Okay.
Ish.
And if people haven't checked it out, they should. They can subscribe to its podcast independently,
That'd be
or they
great.
can subscribe to the entire Meaning of Life TV feed, and or they can subscribe to the Wright Show independently. By the way, so you are at Penn,
Yes.
where you're doing a number of things that have to do with what you call self-transcendent experiences.
Right.
You're looking at various. You got several things going. I mean, first of all, why don't you say a little bit about what it is you do at Penn?
Sure. Well, I work in a few different labs, all on this topic of self-transcendent experience. I work mainly with Martin Seligman in the Positive Psychology Center. So there we're looking at how these experiences might relate to well-being. I work with Andrew Newberg, who's a neuroscientist, and there we look at neuroimaging and what's going on in the brain during these experiences.
Yeah, and he was one of the very first in the game of looking at brain scans of meditators. Right? He was doing this close to 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I read his work in college and kind of tracked him down, and my hope was to work with him. So I'm doing that
And
now.
here you are,
Here I am.
and you're doing. I gather you have a contract with Oxford University Press for a book you're doing with him. That is about. Well, you tell us.
Yeah, so it'll be with Oxford University Press. It'll be the varieties of spiritual experience, a 21st century update. And so we'll take William James's varieties of religious experience, take his general approach, but update it with modern accounts of experiences and fill in the details of all of the empirical work that's been done since.
Okay. And so, and then you're also, and I guess it's related to that you've got this website where people can report spiritual experiences they've had and describe them.
Yeah, varietiscorpus.com. And so we're hoping to educate people a little bit about what our research shows, but even more so, we want people to share their experiences so they can share their experiences publicly so that other people can see that they're not alone, that actually a lot of people are having these kinds of experiences, or they can participate in our research. So there's a link to participate in research studies as well, and that would be anonymous.
Okay, and we'll link to that too.
That'd be great.
Okay, and then another project you've got going is you have produced a manuscript that'll be published somewhere eventually, I guess, in concert with co-authors like Jonathan Haidt, the aforementioned Andrew Newberg, and a couple of other people, right?
Right. Also, Ralph Hood, who's also been working on self-transcendent type experiences for decades, and David Vago at Harvard, who does mostly mindfulness neuroscience research.
And who was on your show, Science of Spirituality, some
He
weeks ago?
was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the paper's very interesting because it looks at self-transcendent experiences like as a thing, a real diversity of self-transcendent experiences. I mean, let's actually. I'm going to read several quotes that you have in the early part of the paper. These are accounts. One of them is from William James's book, Varieties of Religious Experience, which you've alluded to already. And here, somebody that James is quoting is saying, I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, birds, insects, everything in nature. I exulted in the mere fact of existence, of being part of it all. I knew so well the satisfaction of losing self in the perception of supreme power and love. Here's another thing quoted in Alan Watts, 1957. I guess this is somebody other than him that he's quoting, but he was a mystic himself. But in any event, says, I lost the boundary to my physical body. I had my skin, of course, but I felt I was standing in the center of the cosmos. Then finally, this one from Jill Bolton Taylor, who famously suffered a stroke and did a TED Talk about it in a book called what? Stroke of Insight.
Right.
She says, I could no longer clearly discern the physical boundaries of where I began and where I ended. I sensed the composition of my being as that of a fluid rather than that of a solid. I no longer perceived myself as a whole object separate from everything. Okay, so these are kind of a variety of descriptions. In this paper, you all are arguing that there's enough unity here and enough unity among these kinds of reports and other kinds of reports that we should treat these STEs, self-transcendent experiences, as like a phenomenon, and you talk about even having kind of a spectrum of them that you can define. I guess my first question is this is there much of a tradition of treating these in a kind of like analytically unified way, or is this an argument you're trying to make, and are you for now like kind of a minority enterprise trying to convince psychologists that this is worth studying in a systematic way?
Yeah, so with those quotes, there's a long scholarly lineage of what's called the perennialists on the one hand, which is to say, even though those quotes were from a Christian, a Buddhist, and a secular neuroscientist, that they're all having the same experience. So it's a kind of universalist argument. On the other hand, there's the constructivists who say because these people come from such different cultural belief systems, that really these experiences are entirely different. And to equate them is really just a mistake.
Okay.
And so this is the scholarly tradition, and it seems to me pretty clearly a false dichotomy, that they either have to be entirely the same or completely separate. And so the way that we look at them is these experiences do vary according to beliefs and culture, etc. But there is something, there is a strain of similarity or a common cluster of symptoms that you can't ignore.
Right. And you want to look at their, neurological underpinnings. You talk in the book about kind of evolutionary explanations for why there might be this capability in the human mind. I should say that, these three are all pretty dramatic experiences.
Sure.
But other parts of the paper give me the sense that you want to include less dramatic experiences somewhere on this spectrum of self-transcendence, right? So you refer, on the one hand, you refer to the experience of awe, which John Haidt, of course, has studied a lot. And, everyone's, I think, experienced awe, and I think many people would say it didn't feel quite as dramatic or revolutionary as these things. You also mentioned the experience of so-called flow. There's a famous book on flow written by a psychologist whose last name is pronounced something like Csikszentmihalyi.
Right.
And that is a state of absorption in what you're doing. Such a deep state of absorption that you almost lose self-awareness in a way.
Right.
And that, that seems very different from these in the sense that with some of these experiences, like you're like really aware that you're having this experience. You're like, whoa. Whereas with flow, it's almost the opposite. You lose awareness of the fact that you're having an experience, right? Like, so flow could be just deep immersion. Well, I guess deep immersion in reading, but certainly deep immersion in working, in playing music, and that kind of thing, right? So, but you do mean to include all of these things, is that right?
Right. Yeah. So we basically want to say, look, experiences like these seem to exist on a spectrum. People say things like, I lost myself in music, myself went away in meditation. I felt a deep sense of awe, like you say. So we try to position these kinds of experiences on a spectrum of intensity. We call it the unitary continuum. But then we do something else. We identify a number of common psychological constructs that people talk about all the time, like flow, awe, even things like mindfulness along this spectrum, with peak and mystical type experiences being at the far reach, like feeling at one with all things. And you're right, the quotes in the beginning are these extreme kinds of experiences. But all of these constructs, flow and awe, for example, are more different than alike, certainly. And yet also, it seems to us that you can't ignore the fact that the researchers, when they describe these constructs, they say very similar things, like the sense of self drops away and you feel more connected to the world at large. And so we're essentially picking out all of these constructs that the researchers who invented them, first described them, identify themselves this self-transcendent element.
Okay. And that last thing you said about, I forget how you put it, but the sense of self drops away, and then there's this kind of sense of connection. You make a big deal of, I mean, you kind of formalize this as these as the two big things, right? You say there's an annihilational component, which refers to the dissolution of the bodily sense of self, and by reduced social boundaries, you say, and then a relational component, right, which is about that sense of connection.
Yeah. So these two components, actually, my fiance Bit coined those two terms, and I just really like them. And
wait a second. I thought you said Bitcoin for a second, but I must have misunderstood you. Her name,
yeah,
and she coined them. Okay. I was thinking maybe there's a way you can make money off of coining good terms, but no.
So. Although gurus try, I suppose. Yeah. But I thought these were two logically complementary points. I mean, I thought that when your sense of self fades away, you feel more unity. It turns out that that's not true. At least our most recent empirical study shows that you can differentiate those two qualities. We're not sure what that means exactly yet, but you can imagine if you have self-loss without any feeling of unity, that might result in a very confusing or even experience that might be labeled psychotic, perhaps. On the other hand, when you have the self-loss coupled with a sense of unity, it seems like there you're in a territory where mystics have described and a lot of Buddhist meditation seems to aim at.
Okay, and here you mean unity with the outside world, connection with the outside world.
Yeah, connection with something beyond your typical sense of self.
Because the sense of internal unity could conceivably, in some sense, be lessened, right?
A sense of internal unity, like, how do you mean?
Well, the classic Buddhist not self experience begins with thinking of distinguishing among different kinds of things you're having. You're having these different sensations, you're having these different thoughts, you're having these different feelings, there's the five aggregates. And the Buddha takes people, in the oldest discourse on this, Buddha takes people over them one by one and says, is this really part of you, Is this feeling really part of you? Well, no, not necessarily. So there's almost like a breakdown of the sense of the presumed sense of unity that constitutes our conventional sense of self.
Right.
But when you say unity, you're referring to this relational dimension of the.
That would be the relational aspect. This sort of, people will say things like, "I felt connected to everything. I felt at one with all things," is kind of the cliche statement, but we actually see that time and time again in people's descriptions of their experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of other everyday or experiences that many, if not all, people have had that may be on this spectrum, you tell me if they are. So when you're playing on an athletic team, and you can first of all become so engrossed in it that there's almost a sense of flow and the sense of a loss of self-consciousness.
Right.
And there's also a sense of a kind of a sense of unity with other players, especially when things are going well.
Right.
And that translates into actual affection for them. I mean, we just had, not too long ago, the end of the NBA Finals, and, the winning team, they're like hugging each other, and it's not an act. They're like loving each other at that moment.
Sure.
And then you've got playing music as part of a group. You can lose yourself in the music, and, different kinds of music are different. There's improvisational music when you're really feeding off of each other as opposed to, say, just following the dictates of a conductor or a sheet of music.
Right.
Are these things on the spectrum?
I would, I think you'd have to ask each individual person. I just pulled up a description. You're talking about athletic events. Mm-hmm. And so here's one of our participants who indicated that they had a unity experience. They said, during a skeet shooting competition, I realized that I felt utterly connected to everything and everyone in the universe. I experienced an intense feeling of happiness. My attention was nowhere and everywhere at once. And so, this is a person shooting skeet. It's not necessarily something...
Which, by the way, means clay pigeons. So we don't have the contradiction that he was killing birds while feeling a unity with everything. He was just shooting skeet means shooting an inanimate thing, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Although I'm sure that's happened as well. I mean, like Zen and the art of archery.
Right. There are these ironies in mysticism and the martial arts and so on. Okay, so you can be doing almost anything when you have one of these experiences, I guess. So another thing people have felt is just love of kin, right? Love of offspring is a particularly intense version of this. And, William James, I don't think it was in Varieties of Religious Experience. I think he wrote an essay on the self or something, or maybe it's a chapter of a book on psychology, where he talks about how imprecise the bounds of self are. And he says when you love somebody in your family, they become part of yourself.
Sure.
So is that on the spectrum? Love?
Well, love is an experience of intense love, where someone says either my sense of self diminished. I felt this sense of deep connectedness and unity. But it seems like what you're talking about with William James is a bit more cerebral or cognitive. Mm-hmm. He talked about you have as many me's as there are representations of yourself in other people's heads.
Right.
And that seems much more cerebral or philosophical about what the nature of the self. We're very interested in just the brute self-report of people saying, my sense of self went away. And there's been 5 or 6 studies showing that in a lot of different populations, about a quarter or a third of people will say, I felt at one with all things. At least one point in their life, they had one of these completely oneness experiences.
Now, when you say in a lot of populations, you mean what kinds of populations? I mean, you're not saying that 1/4 of the people on the planet have had these?
I would be willing to bet that's the case. Because there's been studies in the U.S., the U.K., in Tibet, in the Middle East.
So these are randomly selected populations where the studies are done?
Well, way more so in the U.S. and the U.K., but there has been some cross-cultural work.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'd be willing to bet that would probably be the case. I bet around a quarter of the world's population has at one point felt at one with all things, or would say that on a.
And these reports go beyond. I was on an athletic team. It felt great. I love my daughter. Blah blah blah. It's like you're talking about really memorable, rare experiences that they felt were just extraordinary.
It seems to be the case. The prevalence is sort of shocking. Gallup has a few questions that they've asked many times. They're a little bit different. They ask things like, have you ever had a mystical experience that changed the direction of your life, for example? And somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population will say yes, which is shocking to me. I mean, I had no idea that the prevalence was so high.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the changes people report, does it tend to be a positive thing? I mean, do they become better people, or I guess we have to take their word for it, and I'm generally skeptical of taking people's word for how good they are. But anyway, what do you find?
Well, that's a big interesting question, and one that we want to address in the book. Freud and James differed completely on this point. Both of them said that they had never had one of these extreme type of experiences. But Freud assumed that they were pathological, and he offered the explanation that oceanic feelings of oneness are a regression to the womb.
Naturally.
Yeah, and that it's regressive and psychopathological. He had no data to inform this. It's just his sense. James, on the other hand, thought that they could consist of our greatest peace. I mean, he thought they were one of essentially the most positive experiences that we're capable of. He just had reports. He didn't really have data either. The data shows that James was much more right than Freud, with some qualification. There definitely are pathological manifestations of this phenomenon. I mean, the dissociative cluster in the DSM describes aspects of self-loss that are very frightening and that people often need therapy or even hospitalization for.
And what is that experience like?
People say things like myself doesn't feel real. That's depersonalization. They'll feel kind of, their body will feel alien to them. Like they'll feel like their body parts aren't their own. So there are
specific things like alien hand syndrome where you think a particular part of you is like not you and you can't control it and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's probably a bit different. But this is more of a general sense where whatever people mean by when they say myself, that somehow seems different in definitely a negative way.
And it tends to freak them out and lead to unhappiness and stuff.
And alienation. People feel isolated from that experience.
So that gets back to what you're saying about loss of self accompanied by no growth in relational kind of connection.
Right. And I think that's going to be a key factor moderating whether these experiences end up being negative or positive. But this only happens in a few percent of people who describe these experiences. In our most recent survey, I think it was 3% said their experience was negative. On the whole, these experiences are positive, sometimes amazingly so. So overwhelmingly, people thought that these experiences were positive to them. 2/3 of our samples said they were in the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. And people at least report that they feel as if they're a more moral person after this experience. And again, that's a big point to be skeptical of because that's just self-report.
Studies show that most people consider themselves more moral than average, and that can't be. They can't all be right. Are there particular conditions that tend to induce these things, like intense pressure, or like, or you find out you have a horrible disease and or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, classically, meditation and prayer were seen as techniques to induce this state, and we still see that. Those are top triggers for these experiences. There's some interesting ones that I wouldn't have expected necessarily, like transitional periods in life. People report these experiences a bit more often.
So transitional period might be like what? You're going off to college, you're changing jobs, you got a divorce, what?
Yeah, we don't know what it means yet.
We don't know. Just saying they had a transitional.
Yeah. So we still have to explore what that actually means. Victor Turner was an anthropologist who talked about liminal spaces inducing these kinds of experiences, which used to be the function of rites of passage and things like that. Maybe a modern example is a meditation retreat. A lot of people experience these states during or right after a meditation retreat.
Yeah. Now, so meditation retreats, I mean, that brings up, again, this Buddhist idea of not self, the idea that it's a true apprehension when you kind of perceive the self as not existing. So I guess the classic Buddhist report of this is clearly different from the pathological report that you alluded to earlier, where people suffer from depersonalization or whatever?
There's some interesting work happening now. I forget who it's by, but a researcher is looking at negative meditation experiences.
Yeah, I think, is she at Dartmouth?
I think so.
Yeah, I forget the name, but yeah, Dark Nights of the Soul. I mean, I've been on meditation retreats, and you can have in bad and intense experiences. I've never had any kind of depersonalization thing. But I'm sure people have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It turns out it's very prevalent, and it's a bit discouraged to talk about in meditation communities because there's such an emphasis on the improvement and the positive side. And so I think it's a great project to raise awareness that these experiences are a bit risky potentially. There's a small degree of risk. Work here.
Well, and there's almost a guarantee that you're going to have some tough times if you go off for a week alone and don't talk to anybody and meditate intensively all day. In my experience, I mean, I still think it's worth it, but I tell people it's like extreme sports for the mind. I mean, it's like harrowing at times.
Right. Yeah, but usually the altered states associated with it, at least in my experience, are positive, and they kind of take you out of the difficulties of, cramped body parts and not a lot of food and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is that your experience?
Well, yeah, and we should remember that Buddhism, at the core of Buddhist philosophy, is the idea of, in a certain sense, confronting everything unpleasant and dealing with it. And so you're supposed to pay attention to suffering. In the long run, paying attention to it is supposed to reduce its negative impact, especially if you attain nirvana, when there's a major reduction. But it's not surprising that you would there'd be some unpleasant things, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring up, is it real? Is the loss of self somehow a more true state than the feeling of self, which is a really interesting point. James was agnostic on that point. He said we can experience some union with something, in italics, greater than ourselves, and in that union find our greatest peace. And I think that something could include anything from an illusion to, maybe just he means a perception of unity. But it's not clear to me if that's more real or more true, or whether it matters.
Yeah. Although a lot of people would be interested in the question. Yeah. I mean, should you trust the experience? I think people who would say, yes, this has changed my life and had a positive impact, I think you'd probably find in most of them the belief that it was in some sense a true apprehension they had. That yes, I am connected with everyone, and that's a truer apprehension than the more selfish perspective we often have, right?
Yeah, and we asked an interesting question, we call it the feeling of realness, where we say, did the experience seem less real, the same, or more real than your everyday reality? And overwhelmingly, people say it felt more real than their everyday reality. So people feel like it's more real, which doesn't tell us much about whether it in fact is more real or not. But you don't see things like that in dreams or fevers. Most altered states feel less real than reality. This is a rare instance of a state that seems to feel overwhelmingly more real. Of course, whether it is more real or not is a separate question.
It is. Let me give you an experience I had on a meditation retreat that in some ways, I've had a few that are somewhere in the zone, but what's interesting about this one is that it wasn't like gushy. I wasn't falling in love with the world, but there was a kind of a sense of connection, but it was pretty cerebral and not that emotional in a certain sense. It was like, I think it was on my first retreat, and I'd been there several days, so I was starting to get in this different kind of space,
Right.
And I was taking a walk, and I saw a lizard, and the way lizards, if they see you, they like freeze and just start like they're moving around, I mean, first of all, one characteristic of I think the state of mind you can get in is you're less reactive and reflexive in the way you respond to things. It's like we have a way that we are used to responding to forms of life, like whether it's cute puppy or like lizard. It's like not a snake. It's not like you're freaking out, but it's also like not warm and cuddly. I'm not going to pet it, and it's like if it starts like running up my leg, that'll be creepy. I mean, you encounter these things with something other than detachment, generally speaking. And I think in subtle ways, your perception of them is colored by feelings and emotions. You may not realize that, but I think that really shapes your perception of these things. But there was a tremendous detachment about the way I was looking at the lizard. It was just like, as if I was an anthropologist from Mars who had happened upon this life form for the first time. I was just like looking at it. And I had the thought that it's okay, so its behavioral programming seems really crude and simple to me. I know what the deal is. It's like looking around, and if I approach it, it's going to run off.
Right.
And that's how simple. It's like there's like 3 rules. There's like 3 steps in the algorithm, right, that are going to determine what it does next. It's very simple. But then I thought, there is you can imagine a being so intelligent that it would look at me and think exactly the same thing, right? It's like I ultimately have these algorithms that aren't all that sophisticated. Like,
right.
You could have predicted probably that if I see a lizard, I'm going to stop and look at it, for example. But anyway, I mean, all of this sounds like very intellectual and analytical, but there was, as a result of that, a certain kind of sense of unity with the lizard. I mean, I don't want to, it wasn't, I guess it was partly emotional. I felt, in a certain sense, more warmly I just felt in the same predicament as the lizard. I felt like we're all in the same, we're put on this planet, we don't know why. Some of us have more in the way of self-awareness than others. I think I have more of that than the lizard, fine. But it's like, I just thought, we're in the same boat here. And so that's a very, that is, so I'm sure it sounds so cognitive, compared to sometimes you hear people and they just say, I just can't describe it. I just can't describe it. It's like,
right.
I was one with the stars. I don't know how to say it. Well, this isn't like that at all. But is this the kind of thing, does this count? Can I be in your database, David?
I don't know.
Oh, no.
It sounds like it was meaningful to you.
Oh, it was very meaningful.
Right.
I think I would have been less likely to eat a lizard afterwards if somebody had offered me some tasty fried lizard.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, there are some people, like Andrew Newberg, for example, describes experiences being brought on through intellectual processes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a school of yoga that is essentially, rather than use it, hatha yoga, like bending your body and doing breathing exercises, is all about rational thought leading you to certain kinds of experiences. Maybe like yours, but you bring up another interesting point, which is that feeling of connectedness with another being, and whether that mm-hmm. leads to more moral behavior. And that's Jonathan Haidt's interest in these experiences. I mean, he's mostly fascinated in the idea that an experience that lasts just a few minutes can have effects for years, which is possible in the most intense varieties of these experiences. Mm-hmm. Your experience doesn't sound like it would have lasted, very long, but the general phenomenon that you're talking about is interesting. This sense of being in the same boat. Jonathan Haidt thinks these kinds of experiences may have evolved. They may have been selected for because they made for more altruistic groups, groups that had more of this capacity, were more cohesive, and therefore more successful, which is a controversial claim. But the general point is perhaps these experiences have some kind of moral utility, at the group level.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the question is, how big is the group? How big is the circle? And so Paul Bloom, for example, thinks, well, these experiences are they're tribal makers. They make people more tribal.
Well, he's talking about empathy largely, right? I mean, he's talking about a sense of connection with the people on your team.
Yeah, but he worries about these experiences also doing something similar. He thinks about, when he hears self-transcendent experience, he thinks mob mentality.
Well, there is that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's like, I don't want to bring up Hitler, but let's bring up Hitler. And, and Wagnerian music, and it stirs your soul, but
right.
it has been put to, and there's this, and you can almost, it's easy to imagine it stirring up a sense of patriotism, and there's a dimension of love to that. But it's not love of everyone on the planet, ultimately, in the way it plays out, right? I mean, so I don't think that's crazy. And in fact, I'd be surprised if John Haidt didn't acknowledge that, look, if this did evolve by group selection, there's a dark side.
Yeah.
Groups, the only way group selection works is if groups are competing with other groups.
Right.
So,
yeah, there's a question of whether that's a different process or not. I went to Marine boot camp, for example, and we did a lot of marching, and I definitely felt the sense of group cohesiveness from that, but it definitely didn't feel anything like a meditation retreat.
Right.
And so certainly there's the dark side, but I think the dark side probably is more on the psychopathology, dissociation area, rather than the moral dark side of tribalism. It seems like a separate process.
I mean, I think the kinds of experiences people are describing to you tend not to feature the dark side. It sounds like, and it could be just the wording that invites people to give you their responses, but I doubt you're getting many responses that say, I felt at one with my people, and as if I wanted to extinguish other people's. You're not hearing a lot of that.
Right.
That could be the way. So it could be that the kind of question you're asking is just encouraging a certain set of people who've had a certain set of experiences to respond. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that none of these processes in the brain are unconnected to the dark side. I think the other point I would personally question whether you're going to get a grand unified explanation in the end, like group selection. I mean, we like just in the set of experiences that I mentioned. I mean, okay, you've got love of offspring, you've got people on an athletic team. Well, those are very different things, and we know why love of offspring evolved. That's not controversial, and that takes you out of yourself. And that doesn't require group selection unless you want to, as some people want to say, well, kin selection should be called group selection. Well, call it whatever you want. We know how it works. Right. And so it just seems like, and then you get to things like my reaction to the lizard, where I'd be surprised if there's any kind of adaptive evolutionary explanation at all, and what that may be more about is an intense experience like a meditation retreat, breaking down my evolved reactions to things. And I might argue that sometimes when you overcome your evolved reactions to things, you're actually seeing the truth. You're closer to seeing the truth than you are when you're reacting to things in the self-interested way we're designed to react to things. So I think it's certainly, interesting to see what all these things have in common and what distinguishes them from one another. I'd be surprised if there was any straightforward, like it's all group selection or it's all anything else.
Yeah, and it's controversial, that evolutionary explanation. I mean, James definitely leaned towards a more individual-based explanation, and that maybe these experiences evolved to bring us out of crippling unhappiness. That's his take on it.
Yeah.
Of course, it could just be a spandrel. I think it's interesting to sort of speculate about the evolutionary aspects, but I don't know if we'll ever have anything more than speculation. But I do think it's important to kind of constrain the what we're talking about to brief mental states, and not more cognitive processes like empathy or long-term patterns of behavior like care of offspring, for example. There still is I think there is a there. I think there really is a phenomenon that people describe pretty frequently using pretty similar language. One example sometimes uses an orgasm. Orgasms are, come about through any number of different ways, through any number of different triggers. They're certainly described differently in different cultures, depending on your beliefs, things like that, and individual differences play a role. But no physiologist, at least, would tell you there's no such thing as orgasms because they're described in different ways and happen in different contexts. So I think similarly with these experiences, my bet is they're a bit like orgasms in that there's a identifiable physiological process that underpins them, and there's a common core of subjective features, even though there's lots and lots of differences as well.
Okay, so can you talk a little about the original work that your collaborator Andrew Newberg did on, the kind of neurology of meditative experiences when he did the brain scans? Because I'm actually not aware of the extent to which he may or may not have revised his early stuff. It seems to me, as I recall, that early on he thought that one thing that happened with deep meditative experiences of a certain kind, at least, was that the part of your brain that kind of defines the bounds of yourself or helps locate you in space and relate you to the external world, that something changed there.
Right. Yeah, so Newberg's original study was to bring in advanced meditators into a neuroimaging scanner, and when they felt an intense subjective state of unity, they imaged the brain, and he found that the posterior superior parietal lobe was inhibited, sort of here, which usually maps the boundaries between yourself and everything else. There's been more recent studies that I think identify a more concise location. Orghezzi's team in Italy did a study where they removed cancerous tumors from patients who had them all over their brains, and they had everyone fill out questionnaires. And the only people who had more self-transcendent experiences afterwards had tumors removed from this particular region of the parietal lobe, not too far from where Andy identified. And so it looks like a few different studies are zeroing in on a relatively specific brain region that maps the boundaries between yourself and everything else, and that region is inhibited during what we'd call self-transcendent experiences. At Penn right now, we're using non-invasive brain stimulation to inhibit that region, and to see if we can get people to feel more connected to things around them. And our pilot study suggests that we can.
You can.
Yeah. And so we're still replicating that and following that up.
That's interesting. Now, one of your science and spirituality shows was about that, right? About that technique.
That's Roy Hamilton is really a world expert in non-invasive brain stimulation techniques.
That's interesting. So, I mean, there, for example, it seems to me like the interpretation would be, well, what's happening here isn't natural in the sense that, look, we're designed to be animals and have a clear, a sense of ourselves. You don't want to, Yeah, I mean, animals walk around acting as if they have a very clear sense of the separation between them and the world, and maybe for whatever reason, this kind of natural thing gets inhibited. And to my mind, that would be far from meaning that you're not getting a truer perception of the world. I'm totally open to the idea that natural selection, in a certain sense, warps, maybe in a moral sense, maybe even in some other sense, but warps our perception of the world. But is that Andrew Newberg's interpretation, or does he even get into like whether this is quote natural or not?
In the sense of just the capacity for the subjective state?
Yeah, like when that part of your brain gets inhibited.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, is he thinking, oh, and this is the brain's designed by natural selection to do that under some circumstances? Or is it more like, well, through extraordinary circumstances, something that's natural just doesn't happen, and then you get this different apprehension?
I think he's pretty agnostic. I think one of the virtues of his approach is that he
Mm-hmm.
makes sure to be agnostic on things that he doesn't know. So I don't think he claims to know. I think he'll speculate at times, like maybe it's co-evolved with the sexual system, or he's thinking about it from a very physiological standpoint,
right,
not the functional kind of way you're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he would come down on whether it gives us a more clear or true picture of reality. He acknowledges that people feel like it's more real, like it seems more real, and we know that now empirically, mm-hmm, that people report that it feels more real. But it seems like it's an entirely different question, whether you're seeing some reality more so as it really is. I don't think these experiences will actually tell us anything about. I don't think they'll shed light on that question at all. I think they certainly open us to different possibilities, and it's truly a gut level perception of a different way of seeing things that's usually totally intellectual. Mm-hmm. Like a form of monism, for example. If you believe, if you're a material monist and you have a feeling of being at one with all things, it could be the case that would sort of confirm your view.
And what do you mean exactly by material monist?
Just believing that the universe is an entirely physical system. There's nothing else. Although we do find an interesting thing that people report more spiritual beliefs. They endorse spiritual beliefs more after these experiences.
What kinds of beliefs? You mean like that there is more than matter, or what?
Yeah. Well, things like that the universe is benevolent. Like Barbara Fredrickson, even inducing something like love on a very subtle level will actually nudge people's beliefs more towards endorsing items like the universe is benevolent. At Dr. Keltner's lab, if they induce awe, people see more patterns in random data. Example. And we find in our data that when people have these experiences, it definitely correlates with spiritual belief. Now, there's people that's not necessary, like people like Barbara Ehrenreich. She wrote a book called Living with a Wild God, and she describes a whole lot of these experiences, but she's an atheist, and so she has an entirely materialistic explanation for the experiences.
Does she? Because I haven't read the book, but I got the sense, partly based on some kind of hostile reviews of by people who themselves seemed like atheists and or materialists. I got the sense that she was kind of leaving doors open for the world being weirder than we commonly assume. Based on her own, she had very intense experiences. Yeah. I think maybe mainly when she was younger, I forget. But so she did not leave the door open?
She describes them earlier in the book as strictly an atheistic interpretation, but yeah, later on in the book, towards the end, she does play around with sort of some philosophy of mind ideas, like we don't really know. It's sort of like the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, well, see, that seems to me just legitimately opened up by this whole thing. I mean, we do not understand consciousness. And we do not have an adequate explanation of why and how we have subjective experience, and that's just a fact. Well, I wouldn't go quite that far because there are a few people who disagree.
Right.
But I think they are wrong. So anyway, but I mean, anyway, there are tons of philosophers who would say, look, that maybe these experiences, there are philosophers who would say maybe these experiences are telling us something that we don't really understand even what they're telling us, but maybe they are relevant to the question of the mind-body problem, right? Like maybe it's not an inherent property of consciousness that it be confined to a single person, and there's something about natural selection that very, very strongly encourages that. I just think that's not. I wouldn't put that in the category of kind of going all woo on us. You know what I mean? Like, for example, you mentioned people seeing patterns in things like, oh, that's no mere coincidence. Like, that's too spooky. And the universe, so this is the universe telling me to do X and Y, this coincidence. I would put that in another realm of the more almost conventionally religious. But I think, raising questions about consciousness, it seems to me, is one thing this stuff does.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the argument for experience, or argument from experience, which gets short shrift, I think, sometimes. If you have a decent percentage of the population saying things like consciousness seemed everywhere at once,
right,
and we have no means of testing whether or not that is in fact the case, then I think that's a good reason to leave the door open to that possibility. I think it's a leap of faith to say it's definitely true or definitely not true.
We have no means of ultimately testing any claim about conscious experience. That's how we know it's different from just the other things science studies. It's subjective. So,
right.
But I mean, it's interesting that I've talked to a number of people who have meditated really intensively. Some of them have been chosen to do these brain scan experiments because they're so adept at meditation. And it's really not at all an uncommon report to say, my awareness is where the thing being perceived is, It's not just in my head. I mean, it's a not uncommon thing. And it seems to be induced by a certain systematic type of mental exercise. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong.
Right.
But
I mean, actually, I think Bertrand Russell, he's a philosopher that's not often brought into this discussion, but I think he's done some great thinking on the topic. He had a self-transcendent experience.
Did he?
Yeah, he had really beyond that, a mystical type experience. He felt like he could read other people's thoughts, felt completely connected to other people. He describes it in a lot of detail. And he takes a lot of it back after the experience. He said certain aspects of this were no doubt a delusion,
mm-hmm.
and yet the positive benefits mostly remained. So for him, he very sharply differentiates between the experience and its benefits, sort of taking a pragmatic approach to it, and then putting in a box those things that seem like knowledge claims that he felt like he couldn't know or couldn't verify. And that seems to me a really great approach to this. He said, as a creed, mysticism is unprovable and sometimes unintelligible, but as an experience, it brings out whatever's best in man,
mm-hmm.
Which is a really profound endorsement
mm-hmm.
of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the interpretations are, for a lot of people, the most interesting parts. But for me, it's always what I want to set aside and get back to the experience itself and the underlying physiology and the outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
But interpretation inevitably comes back into the question.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part and parcel.
Okay. So we're kind of running out of time here, but kind of in closing, just to narrow our focus a little, it sounds to me, I mean, we've talked about a lot of different kinds of experience, different reports.
Yeah.
But you did mention that, prayer and meditation can induce these states. And so it sounds like one of the prospects you're taking seriously is that if you do confine yourself to what you might call, religious mystical experiences or mystical experiences that are within a specific spiritual tradition, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, that although you will get somewhat different descriptions, like Christian mystics might be more likely to say this was a union with God. Right. Hindus might be more likely to say it's a merger of Atman and Brahman, where Brahman is not like a personal God so much, but more like the soul of the universe or something. And then some Buddhists might describe it as an experience of unity, but some would be careful not to, in keeping with the doctrine that the self doesn't exist, so it can't be unified with anything. They might describe it more as like just dissolution of self. Other Buddhists might describe it as unity. But you're taking very seriously the possibility that in all of these cases, what's going on in the brain is fundamentally the same thing, and people's interpretations, experiential interpretations, and in a certain sense, even experiences, are being shaped by kind of the doctrine they grew up with, so to speak.
Yeah, I would add humanist to that list as well. But yeah, I think certainly culture and belief plays a large part in all experience, and this is no exception. But I do think that there is a common core of subjective features to this experience. Because we all have the same nervous system, we have some similar, even universal aspects.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. In closing, let's remind people of a couple of things. First of all, there's your show, The Science of Spirituality, which they can subscribe to on meaningoflife.tv and just listen to on an occasional basis if they prefer. Also, what's the website again? We'll link to it, but the website where people can kind of fill out this, it's kind of like a questionnaire, I guess, about any, how are you describing them generically? Transcendent experiences they've had, or?
We're actually calling them spiritual experiences,
okay.
And that's a data-driven solution. We ask people what they call these things, and overwhelmingly spiritual one. And so for the website, we call them spiritual experiences.
Okay. And the URL is?
Varietiescorpus.com.
Varieties being a reference to the William James book, and corpus being a reference to what? The body or what?
Oh, no, collection of,
I see. A body of reports of.
Yeah. One of the main things we're hoping to do is computational linguistic analysis. And so once we do some machine learning, people will be able to type in their experience, paragraph or two, and the algorithm will automatically sort what type of experience they've probably had.
I see.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I would think there's a lot you can do with this when you've got a whole bunch of reports from different people.
Right. Yeah. We need a lot of data. So
okay.
Every little bit helps.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, David. And good luck with the book.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
See you.